So this happened long ago. It was like 2003 or 2004, and I was about 17 or 18 at the time. Online dating was basically a new thing, and it was fun and exciting. I was single at the time and was talking to different people online, just flirting and having fun. One day a guy contacted me on a dating site. He was kind of handsome and polite, typical boy next door looking with blonde hair and blue eyes, and I was intrigued. I learned that he was 6 years older than me. He lived pretty far from me, but it was exciting to talk to him. We started talking daily, getting to know each other, planned on meeting up, where he said that he would buy me plane tickets and stuff like that. And as a teenage girl, getting that kind of attention from an older man who's actually nice and even funny, I seriously thought about accepting his offer. So we played with the thought of doing just that next school break. We continued to talk, but the more I got to know him, the more I realized that maybe he was too mature for me, because he talked a lot about politics, news, and stuff like that, and as a teenager, I couldn't care less about that. And so I began to lose interest, and eventually our daily contact just fizzled out. Time would go by, I would meet someone else, get married at 23 and build a new house and just grow up. Years later, July in 2011, my husband and I were laying floor in our new house when news cut through the music on the radio. A bomb had gone off in the country's capital. We, as the rest of the population, were in shock and rushed to turn on the TV and watch the news. You see, an attack had happened in Norway. The first attack was a car bomb explosion within the executive government quarter of Norway, and the bomb was placed inside a van next to the tower block housing the office of the then Prime Minister. The explosion killed 8 people and injured at least 209, 12 severely. 2 hours later, a second attack happened at a summer camp on the island of Utøya. The camp was organized by the AUF, the youth wing of the ruling Norwegian Labour Party, AP. A man, dressed in a homemade police uniform and showing false identification, took a ferry to the island and opened fire at the participants, killing 69 and injuring 32. Among the dead were friends of the Prime Minister and the stepbrother of Norway's crown princess. The Utøya attack is the deadliest mass shooting by a lone individual in modern history, and the attack was the deadliest in Norway since World War II. When they apprehended the suspect, they reported that it was a 32-year-old Caucasian man, and they showed his picture, and he just looked like a normal white dude. But somewhere in the back of my mind, he looked very familiar, but I just brushed it off. As the case moved forward, more pictures of him flooded the media, and one day an old picture of him was in the news, and I felt my stomach drop, and my entire body went cold. I realized why he looked familiar. He was the political guy I was chatting with years prior. It was the picture that he had used as a profile picture on the dating website, and I honestly felt physically ill. I haven't told anyone this, as you can imagine the reactions that would get. All I can say is that I am so happy I stopped talking to him when I did. So I worked at a domestic violence shelter, and I've seen a lot of stuff. Some paranormal, some just the truest chills of human nature. One of these instances was when a woman came to the rather large shelter that I was working at after leaving her partner. Pretty typical, only her partner was an ex-military sniper. Naturally, she came in the weeks our regular night shift workers were off on vacation, so I had been voluntold to take off my regular day shifts and have the pleasure of working alone. Now I start my shift, nothing much to note, help the residents get their medications, do some chores while I watch some Netflix. Usually I'm a horror junkie, but I would never watch it at work, mostly because I would become extra jumpy and I was certain that the place was actually haunted. As there were women who had passed in the building, but most of the spirits were chill, and I'm certain that they were messing with me at times. Anyways, at the time, our office had windows that looked out onto our tall pine trees in the backyard, designed to give us privacy for our residents' sake. However, at night, all you could see was darkness leering at you with no shielding from curtains. Naturally, our backs were turned to the window, making us feel pretty vulnerable. The windows at least had tints, but it didn't matter because we could still see outside, and anything outside could see us. At this point in my job, I had seen multiple residents' ex-partners who they had fled, trying to peek in or even break in, but nothing compared to this dark night with not even a glimmer of moonlight. So I went to complete my assigned chores, hoping to finish them and then relax until everyone woke up in the morning. I took my time in the basement where most of my chores were. The basement was the floor below my office where the residents stayed, and when I returned, I started getting cozy for my shift. I wrapped myself in a blanket, put on some goofy rom-com, and just relaxed. And this is until I felt like I was being watched. I had a habit of always feeling like something was watching me, though, as I grew up in a house with a similar window situation and was just a very anxious kid. I initially brushed it off as me being paranoid, which wasn't a bad thing, but I checked the many cameras that we had and didn't notice anything out of place inside or out. I continued snacking and watching my movie, and at around 2 a.m., when most residents were asleep, one of them knocked on the office door. This always spooked me at night, but I went to answer it. It was one of the residents, looking very panicked. She explained that she believed that she had heard someone out in the backyard while she was in her room and was worried that it was one of their ex-partners. The residents all had windows that could open to the backyard, too small for anyone, but a small child could fit through, but still. So I double-checked with this resident that hers was closed, and we had a policy that all windows be closed at night, especially at curfew, which was midnight. She said hers was closed, but that it sounded like someone was in the backyard. I suggested that she go to her room, close the blinds, and I would look into it. Again, I peered outside into the darkness, both on the cameras and with my own eyes, and I saw nothing out of place, but felt an absolute pit in my stomach as the darkness kind of stared back. I let this woman know that I didn't see anything but would check regularly. She thanked me and said that maybe she was paranoid. I reassured her that the building was secure but understood her fear. One thing about working at a shelter is that even if you're scared, you can't show it to the residents or they panic, rightfully so, tenfold. So despite my stomach in knots, I kept a calm and cool demeanor. As soon as I returned to the office at about 3:30 a.m., I felt a little bit better and went to sit down. And that's when I noticed something dash into the pine trees. Absolutely petrified and going against my human nature, which screamed to bolt like a madman, I went to investigate near the window. I cautiously crawled because I didn't want to be seen by some wild man out there. I couldn't see anyone, but I again felt that gaze and noticed one of the pines move. When I say that I had never called the police quicker, I mean it. Luckily, because my workplace was well known by the police, they arrived pretty quickly. I met them at the front door and explained the situation and mentioned the woman with an ex-military partner. The police fanned out and looked around the pines. Luckily, no one was found, but they did find that something had disturbed the pine trees, and they did find one of those sort of fake leave/camouflage suits. I think they're called a ghillie suit. And right then, they might as well have just commanded me to poop my pants. They suggested that it was possible someone with a military background was in the pine trees trying to scope out the shelter, and I felt like I had just lived 3 lives in one night. The police said that it appeared the person had left, likely after seeing the flashing red and blue lights. They then left and said to call back if I felt unsafe again. The rest of the night was uneasy until my manager and other coworkers came in. Luckily, I had never seen curtains put up so quickly and security guards hired. And this happened while the woman and another resident with an ex and Hell's Angels were no longer with us. I have no certainty that it was that ex-military person, but based on how I felt that I was being stalked like prey, and how she had described her ex-partner, it truly did feel like him. I'm I'm a physician from Western Massachusetts. Unfortunately for me, I started as an officially licensed doctor in the fall of 2019, meaning that the pandemic was where I had to get my sea legs for being a hospitalist, so to speak. Being a new physician during the pandemic was harrowing for many reasons, but this experience was by far the most disturbing I have had since I started practicing. As a bit of a preamble, I have never completely understood why people have such an intense fear of oblivion. If you were kidnapped, tortured, and eventually killed by Albert Fish, would you truly be interested in an afterlife where you retain that memory? Death is often very merciful because it's true erasure. You no longer have to live with terrible pain or haunting experiences. Trauma lives on only for those who can remember it. And as for hell, I think we are able to create something much worse than fire and brimstone, even with the best of intentions. And that is where this story comes in. During the height of the pandemic, a lot of non-ICU staff were being asked to help run the ICU because of the volume of critically ill patients and it being so unbearable. Normally, I only work with hospitalized patients on the regular wards floor, but in December of 2021, I was drafted to be a pseudo-ICU doc, much to my own dismay. The vast majority of our ICU patients were intubated, and for those unfamiliar, this means that they had a breathing tube in because their lung tissue was completely non-functional. Despite what you might see on TV, most patients who are intubated are given sedating medications. They essentially sleep through the experience. This is both humane and therapeutic. We generally don't want people who are intubated to try to breathe on their own, as it can essentially overinflate their lungs. The day this happened was like any other normal shift. The patient in question was a 60-year-old woman with no past medical history. She had been intubated for 2 weeks because her immune system had essentially shredded her lungs trying to eliminate her COVID infection. Pretty much the same story as most people who went through that, and like many others, she was only slowly recovering. Her blood pressure, however, had really been difficult to control. It had been dangerously low intermittently throughout her entire admission. Because of this, the sedating medication we used primarily was ketamine, which generally doesn't affect your blood pressure. If anything, it actually makes it a little bit higher, but can be associated with dissociative reactions, which is a type of psychosis. When you've been on the ventilator for that long, your trachea actually starts to become rigid and inflexible. If that change happens, you can't really breathe without a ventilator tube, and your body is essentially molded around this foreign instrument. And because of this, after about 2 weeks, we decide whether or not you need to have a tracheostomy performed. Think of smokers with a hole in their neck. This often has a very negative impact on a patient's life, so in an effort to see if she could breathe on her own, we began lowering her sedation. 30 minutes later, I heard it. Initially, I couldn't recognize the sound. It was like if you recorded the sound of a blender and then listened to it on cheap headphones. The sound was high in pitch, but at the same time, it was a bit muffled and coarse. When I turned around, I saw this patient sitting up straight in bed. I gasped and moved back slightly. That sound I heard was her screaming into her ventilator tube. Not yelling, not hollering. She was screaming bloody murder through her ventilation tube. Her eyes were bloodshot and bulging, and it looked like she was also crying, but that may have been the artificial tears. Blood was also starting to leak down the corners of her mouth, oropharyngeal and laryngeal trauma from her screaming so vigorously. Since she had COVID, there was no one in the room with her when she initially started screaming, and this was part of infection control. In order for us in healthcare to not contract COVID, we needed to essentially be in hazmat suits to interact with a COVID patient. We all rushed to get the proper equipment on to enter her room, and in that time, she managed to completely pull out her ventilatory tube to our conjoint horror. And I'll never forget the things that she said when we got to her bedside. She was pleading with us.
Please, send me back. Please, this is all wrong. This is not who I am anymore. I don't want to be here. It hurts, and it's wrong. I don't want them to notice I left. I want to go back. Please, send me back.
Mind you, she was saying this through the blood that was now leaking down her throat and up through her mouth from the trauma of removing the tube. We did eventually get the tube back in after we gave her some emergency sedation, but the damage was already done. She died a few hours later. One family member was able to visit her at bedside while she passed, and we didn't have the heart to explain in full graphic detail what had happened. We only said that she took her breathing tube out and it had caused a lot of damage. I don't know where our consciousness lies when we are sedated for that long, but I am afraid of that place. Death is permanent, but it is also balanced and equal. Everyone rests in oblivion, unbound from the traumas of life. The hells that we can create, however, those places do not seem nearly as merciful. This story happened to me back when I still lived with my parents. I was commuting to college at the time and had 3 siblings that also lived at home, my brother and 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded on both sides by woods and farm fields. Additionally, during the week, my dad normally left for work at 2 a.m., so I had always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy happening. However, on this night, because it was the weekend, my dad was home. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. We had separate rooms upstairs, and coming out of our rooms, you could look down over the banister and see our front door. When I woke up, it took a few moments to get out of the haze and realize what was going on. I looked at the clock and it was around 2:30 a.m. and my brother told me that there were 2 men at our front door. Of course, now this was a real wake-up call. We quietly walk out of my room and peek over to look down at the front door. When we looked, there was no one at the door, but I noticed my parents off to the side out of view of the glass on the front door, and I whispered down to my father, and he told me that there were 2 men who had been talking to each other and knocking on the door. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I went back into my room and grabbed my pistol, quickly shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure that they weren't at the door. If they had been, they would have easily seen me coming down the stairs as it's in the direct view of the door. My brother is right behind me as we head over to where my parents are, whispering to try and find out what's going on. My parents had woken up to our dog barking and come out to see these 2 men knocking loudly at the door. At this point, we see the men return and they begin knocking again, despite the fact that no one had come to the door and our dog is still actively barking. The fact that they were there at this time in a location where houses are very spread out, hundreds of yards, and still knocking while the dog was barking made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes, the men walk away and we all shuffle across the kitchen into the family room to peek out the windows into our driveway, which is lit up by our outside light. There was a black Cadillac sitting there, but no one was inside from what we could see. Immediately, the question was, where did they go? They weren't in their car, and they were no longer at the front door. Unfortunately, we figured out the answer when the handles on our back French doors started jiggling. They were actively trying to enter the back of our house, which enters the kitchen. At this point, I just remember my mom frantically saying David as pure terror overwhelmed her. At this point, 2 things happened. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility that I might have to shoot these men. Secondly, my dad finally grabbed the phone, called the police, and calmly told them what was happening. Thankfully, after a minute of the jiggling, they stopped at the back door and disappeared again, only to return to their knocking at the front. However, at this point, several minutes had gone by and suddenly we saw the local police fly up in multiple cruisers with their lights on. As they whipped into our driveway and front yard, the 2 men bolted away, attempting to run the long way around the house across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of our view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer yelling for him to get on the ground. He didn't, and he was immediately tased and fell on the ground. Some of the officers went around the house after the other guy, and one of them came to talk to my dad and I as we came out the front. They ended up finding the other man hiding in my sister's little playhouse in the backyard. It appears both of them were drunk and or high, as the one who hid had cocaine on him. And while they were both arrested that night, we never did find out what they were charged with or what happened to them. And needless to say, the whole experience was not fun. And it was another reminder that you're not even safe out in the sticks. I, a 40-year-old female, went to the University of Buffalo fresh out of high school in the early 2000s. At that time, the online world was a bit like the Wild West, which included having to do quite a bit more digging to find specific information than today's split-second Google search. And as such, it was much easier time for colleges and universities to hide or spin campus crime statistics to make themselves look better for prospective students. Case in point, I was at orientation a month or two before my freshman year, and one of the mass presentations I had to attend was about campus safety. Bright-faced upperclassmen orientation aides enthusiastically verbally flated the school, boasting about how North Campus was at the time, the safest town in the country, Amherst, New York, and that the only murder in recent history has occurred 9 years ago to an unfortunate student named Linda Yalem, who was murdered on the campus's bike path during a lone early morning run. It was a fate that we were assured could be avoided by simply not hitting the bike path alone. What they conveniently didn't reveal was that A, the killer hadn't been caught, and B, Yalem wasn't his only victim, as he was a serial killer who had already been active in the area for at least 25 years in downtown Buffalo and on the secluded bike paths of the Buffalo suburbs. In retrospect, had this information been as readily accessible as it is now, it probably would have kept me from the most bone-chilling encounter of my life. Fast forward 3 years, I was very depressed, a 20-year-old who was struggling with her identity and her parents' reaction to it in a much less accepting time than now. I'd left school and, to avoid being home, shacked up with a woman who'd promised me the world but then rejected me in favor of her ex-girlfriend on the night I moved in and eventually turned out to be a felon who drained vulnerable would-be love interest bank accounts, though that's a very convoluted story for another time. So clearly, I was an unhappy young adult desperate for love and a sense of belonging, sometimes to my own detriment. Despite my roommate's many unkind and hurtful gestures, I stuck with it in the naive hope that she would eventually come around and fulfill her pie-in-the-sky promises to me. On a particular July night, that hope just fell flat. I was at Roxy's Green Room, a now-defunct lesbian bar and club that many wayward Buffalo lesbians, myself included, flocked to at night to feel a much-needed sense of community and to hopefully land a special someone. Since the latter just wasn't happening for me, and since I didn't yet know what kind of person she really was, I was still stuck on my roommate. She liked to dangle emotional carrots overhead out of some sick joy that she got from making me hurt, but also hang on to hope, and after a promise to hit Roxy's alone with me and talk about us, she showed up with her ex-turned-current and shut me out. I was wounded and upset enough to leave at around 1 a.m., well before the 4 a.m. last call that I was still young and spry enough to stomach, and without a ride home like my usual wiser self would have secured. While my apartment on Delaware was walking distance from Roxy's, it was a good half-hour walk. Being as emotionally charged as I was, though, I angrily hoofed it down the Main Street sidewalk, still managing to follow the pedestrian rule of walking against traffic despite stupidly ignoring a rule that I knew well from years of watching forensic shows. If you're a woman, never leave a bar at night alone, especially if you're walking. I got exactly halfway home when a dark green sedan started driving toward me. I thought nothing of it until the car slowed down near me as I walked. A lone middle-aged man was in the car with a skin tone that I originally associated with the guy being Italian, but in retrospect, he could have easily been Puerto Rican. He had dark hair and, more importantly, almost impossibly dark eyes that seemed to hold no light of good intentions. Now, I was used to guys being pigs. I'd been catcalled by downtown construction workers when an ex-girlfriend and I shared a kiss, and I'd endured all manner of wholly unwanted, graphic, and ham-fisted advances from dudes at school. And although I'd never take that stance that I was asking for it, I was young and thin, so I dressed in a tight red top with flare-legged black spandex pants. The getup was meant to turn women's heads, so I wasn't exactly surprised that I caught the attention of the wrong gender. I paid it little mind, past mild irritation, that a guy old enough to be my dad would look at me like that as the guy drove off and turned at the next intersection behind me. My walk resumed. I put the guy out of my mind and continued my trek, but the peace didn't last. About 2 or 3 minutes later, I see a familiar green car coming up on me again. This time, the guy's window was down a bit and he shouted, "Hey!" in a beckoning manner and gestured in a way that made me wonder if he thought I was a lady of the night. Now that incensed me. Despite my recent struggles with my identity and the resulting entropy in my life, I was always a good kid. I flashed him a quick, annoyed look to inform him that despite the mildly revealing clothing, he was barking up the wrong tree for several reasons, and then I ignored him, focusing forward. And he sped off again, and turned again. At that point, it was clear that the dude was casing me like a cat burglar cases a house. It was before the time of Uber or even widespread use of cell phones, and with no cabs passing by, I had little hope of getting one. Public transit existed, but it was both sparse and not running nearby. The stretches of Main between intersections were long enough, and I'd probably be spotted on them anyway since the guy was circling. Being 15 minutes away from both Roxy's and my home, there was also no way that I could get anywhere near either place before the green car came back round again. I quickly thumbed through my mental Rolodex of true crime show-inspired safety tips that should have kept me out of this situation in the first place. Tip 1. Get to an open business. Inform the clerk. Have him or her call the police and stay put. Then the guy would either give up or get caught. I was coming up on the convenience store on the opposite side of the street where I bought a pack of cigarettes earlier in the night, but as I got closer, the desolate blackness through the windows told me that it was closed. I looked around for something else, another bar, a gas station, anything, but the street was flanked by shuttered brick buildings and locked-up churches. And then came the headlights and green again. Again, the guy slowed down as he approached me, but his demeanor had shifted again. He put his palm out impatiently, as if he couldn't understand my lack of complicity. "Come on," the guy yelled through his now open window, his face an equal picture of aggression, intimidation, and frustration. I kept out of arm's reach on the sidewalk and once again ignored him, but this time I was properly shaken. He angrily punched the gas and was off on his familiar circuit back around to me. Now I knew that I was in trouble. The guy's behavior was escalating, and I was genuinely scared that his next move would be to grab me off the sidewalk and pull me into his car. And from there, God only knew what sort of depravity I was in for. I scrambled through my memory for another safety tip, and I remembered that making myself both impossible to ignore and obviously in distress could get me some much-needed attention from an outside party. I ran into the middle of Main Street and started frantically waving my hands and shouting at every car that was coming my way. The first drove by, the second car drove by, and the terror in me was palpable. I knew the stories of the city dwellers like Kitty Genovese who were left to their horrible fates at the hands of monsters by jaded throngs of people who heard the attacks perpetrated on them and their cries for help, but did nothing out of both an assumption that someone else would step up and a reluctance to get involved. Would I be the next victim of the bystander effect, snatched away to an early end because of big city indifference? As I was beginning to lose hope, but still determined to keep trying while thinking of my next bold move, a van pulled over that had 4 black guys in it. As a white woman, I was relieved. I knew that statistically male predators overwhelmingly tended to prey on women of their same race. In a game of numbers, this van full of guys was exceptionally safer than that single stalker in the green car, and I opted to take the gamble. I frantically told them about the man in the green car who kept circling around the block and following me and begged for a ride home. The driver asked if I had any money in exchange for the favor. I didn't. Then he asked if I had any cigarettes. I may be one of the only people you ever meet who actually had her life saved by smokes, though I had never been a smoker before. I briefly picked up the filthy habit because New York State bars still allowed smoking, and it was a weird part of Buffalo lesbian bar culture that I emulated to fit in, yet another way that I was, as are many, kind of an idiot in my early 20s. "Yes," I answered urgently. "I just bought a pack and you can have the whole thing if you get me home." Admittedly, I was initially a little miffed that the driver wanted something from me in exchange for not letting me get abducted off the street, as well as the implication that he may not have helped me if I had nothing. Still, I had the Marlboros, he had a vehicle, and the stars had hopefully aligned. Regardless of how it went down, I had help if he let me in and the details didn't matter. After a second or two of thought, which seemed like an eternity to me, the driver agreed, and one of the two dudes in the back opened the side door for me and got out so I could slide into the seat behind the driver. As the door to my safe carriage, full of impromptu nights, shut and I got buckled in, I looked out my window just in time to see the green car creeping past the van and proving to my saviors that I was telling a very disturbing true story. Until my dying day, I will never forget that man's eyes. Feeling safe surrounded by a closed van full of young, tough-looking rescuers, I looked that bastard dead in the eyes. Part of me was rightfully terrified, but another part of me wanted to look right at him defiantly and tell him with my eyes, "I got away from you. I win." I was repaid with the most evil, hateful look that I've ever had directed at me, let alone seen. His eyes were black like a cat's eyes get when it sees a bug in the house and its hunting instincts cause its pupils to blow to allow more light in. But at least there's usually a hint of playful mischief in a hunting cat's eyes. The eyes I was seeing were those of pure, unadulterated predator, and the vitriol that practically oozed from them as he glared at me let me know exactly how he felt about his prey having the audacity to elude him. He drove off into the night, and so did we, in a bit less direct route to make sure that we lost him. After a blessedly quick jaunt with frequent looks behind my shoulder, I was delivered home, one pack of cigarettes short but alive and in one piece. The first thing that I did when I got into the door was check the locks on absolutely everything. After that, the adrenaline started to wear off and the pure fear set in. I was so terrified that the man in the green sedan was searching the area where I got dropped off that I grabbed the cordless phone, then lay completely flat on the living room floor for hours for keeping totally out of sight from any of my apartment windows. As I lay there, I called the Buffalo police and relayed my terrifying tale in as much detail as I could give them. Being painfully aware of the prevalence of hate crimes against the LGBT community at that time, I told the cops that it was possible that the man was cruising near Roxy's to prey on vulnerable queer women who were out and about. In hindsight, I think the guy just saw who he thought was an easy mark out by herself and availed himself of the opportunity to strike. Fast forward another 4 years, and I had moved out to Chicago to live with my then girlfriend. For about half of our 4 years there, I was pretty homesick. I'd never lived anywhere except my home state of New York, and I went there knowing no one except my ex, who wasn't exactly an empathetic soul, adding to my feelings of isolation. I coped by keeping up on upstate New York news so I'd feel a little less far away. On a chilly mid-January morning in 2007, I was at our computer looking up headlines from my home state when one from WBFO popped up that immediately snared my attention. Bike path killer is arrested. By then, I knew the moniker well. The internet had since aged into a beautifully organized repository of sometimes knowledge, and despite the lack of transparency from my alma mater, I became familiar with the Buffalo area mystery man and his active status throughout my time in Buffalo. And now I had a name for the specter responsible for that bit of eeriness that was always in the back of my mind when I was a student. The bike path killer was revealed as Artemio Sanchez, a middle-aged native of Puerto Rico who coached his son's sports teams and was affectionately referred to as Uncle Al in his neighborhood. As with many other killers, his disguises were his community involvement and just being ordinary. The man was estimated to have been responsible for 9 to 15 violations of women around the Buffalo area since 1975, and had confessed to 3 murders: the Yalem murder in 1991, a second in 92, and a third which had occurred only 3.5 months prior to his capture. I don't know if you've ever felt your heart somehow get wedged up into your voice box and get dropped into the depths of your stomach simultaneously, but believe me when I say that it's possible, given the right catalyst. And for me, that catalyst was the printed proof that the man was active while I lived in Buffalo and frequented Roxy's. More so, I knew that serial killers rarely take breaks as lengthy as the one between his 1992 and 2006 killings. He had to have at least been attempting to sate his evil impulses for those 14 years. And that realization gave me a very, very bad feeling that I'd crossed paths with someone much more dangerous than I'd realized. The news articles had no picture of Sanchez, but the sickening feeling in me prodded me to find one. It was almost as if I knew what I would see before I even ever looked at him. A Yahoo searched his name, because that was still a respectful means of finding things on the internet in 2007, and I was horrified, though not surprised, to see those same black, soulless, predatory eyes that I looked into 4 times on that summer night in Buffalo in 2003. The timeline fit. My profile as a victim fit if he did, in fact, mistake me for a downtown prostitute, and bearing all else, I knew those eyes. I had a potentially deadly encounter with Altimio Sanchez, the bike path killer. My lack of sense put me in his orbit, and a van of angels pulled me out of it. I know who I saw, and as God is my witness, I will never be convinced otherwise. Though many of the victims fell victim to the statutes of limitation, Altimio Sanchez pled guilty to the 3 murders and was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. In essence, the guy won't be exposed to the outside again unless he's in a body bag. When I started middle school, I made a friend named Erica. One of the first things that she said to me was that she hated supermarkets and grocery shopping in general. I laughed at her at the time and asked, "Why? Your mom won't buy you candy or gummy bears or something?" And she responds by saying, "No, because I was almost kidnapped by a man at a supermarket when I wandered away from my mother." And that was the first time that I had been really sobered as a child. I was a talkative person who could always respond with an awesome comeback and maybe even a little joke, even as a kid. But that comment, which she made as if it were just common knowledge, was very distressing. I asked her for more details, and she explained all that she had gone through. She wasn't taken, thanks to her mom's quick senses. I wondered if the guy had been caught, and Erica said that he had, but that her mother warned her he wasn't the only one who did such things. She also told me to be careful who I trusted. It was solid advice for a middle schooler, and I perceived Erica as a really mature person thanks to that conversation, and decided I would maintain being friends with her. The problem was that I quickly realized Erica wasn't just wise because of this experience. Years later, I would learn to give her situation a sort of name: traumatized. But back then, I started seeing her as paranoid about almost every stranger, particularly men. Now, don't get me wrong, I get it now, of course, but at the time it was quickly getting annoying. Every time we went anywhere, she was very wary of everyone. She told me not to speak to certain people, and sometimes it was literally another teacher we didn't know, because in our school, we had one teacher for almost every subject except PE, and other grades had their own teachers. Other times, she would be scared of the bigger kids. When we got older and started going out on our own, like to malls and movies, things were even worse. She was in a constant state of alertness, but I considered it a state of war. But I would often tell her that she couldn't keep acting that way because we were going to meet strangers, and honestly, sometimes strangers could become friends. just like we did. Erica said that it was different because we had the same classes and saw each other every day, and she didn't fully trust me until I proved that I was a nice person, which, at that age, meant that I shared my snacks at lunch with her. Come on, girl. Now, you're probably wondering why I didn't stop being friends with her immediately if she was this annoying. Well, the truth is, I didn't know. I could easily have made friends with others. The other girls in our class were fun, but I felt like I owed it to Erica because we had become so close before I even realized how much trouble she was by her own experiences. I also thought it was nice having someone who was always aware of our surroundings. Our moms had already met and liked each other too, and I couldn't give up my first real friend in my new school, so I stuck it out. But I honestly wanted to change that when we reached high school, though. It was a significantly larger school, and our first day there was an absolute mess for Erica. Everyone was a possible threat. The worst was that we had one of the best football teams in the state, meaning that some of the boys were huge and incredibly intimidating. Erica would pivot and run away whenever one of them walked by. It was very inconvenient. And as girls, we'd heard stories and been warned enough to be careful, even with just boys who were in our class. So taking on a cautious attitude wasn't a bad idea, but it wasn't sustainable. Our high school was much different than our middle school, with one teacher and always sitting in the same classes for the entire time. In high school, Erica and I had different classes and schedules. We only shared a couple over those 4 years, and I also started to make friends with other people. I found it refreshing to not be constantly on edge or have someone always commenting, "That one looks like a bad guy. That girl is not nice to people. Let's just eat by ourselves." I'm sorry, but for a teen who wants to exert her independence for the first time, that can get real tiring real fast. I didn't feel great about this, but I started sitting at lunch with some of my new friends. I did invite Erica over, but she was uncomfortable as always. I wouldn't say that we drifted completely apart because I still considered her a friend, but a lot changed. It wasn't a mispopularity versus a loner geek situation, however, we just naturally drifted apart. During our senior year, Erica and I only had one class together, home economics, which I'm now learning has changed a lot. Apparently it's called consumer science in some schools these days, and those courses look different and actually useful, but I digress. For the entire first semester, we had a teacher named Mrs. Bradley. However, for the second semester, we got a substitute because Mrs. Bradley fell and broke her hip. The new lady was much younger, and she couldn't be anywhere over 25. I knew Erica wouldn't like this. Changing teachers wasn't easy, but surprisingly, it only took a few days for Erica to warm up to Mrs. Perrin. And I was shocked. Had she changed that much during these past few years? And then I was glad because Mrs. Perrin was a quietly reserved woman, much like my friend, but she was nice to anyone who wanted to listen. Most of the people in that class only took it as an easy elective, but Mrs. Perrin noticed anyone who took it seriously. Erica was always interested in manual creative stuff like crochet, so she was perfect. She bonded with our teacher in a way that she hadn't with others. Because of how easy it felt to be around my friend again, I started finding crochet fascinating during that 1-hour class. It was comforting, and it was nice to actively talk to Erica like we used to. She had become comfortable with our school, recognized that the huge boys on the football team weren't threats, for the most part, and was acting like a bomb could drop on her at any moment. And I marveled once more that Erica spoke with a maturity that was beyond me and my close friends. And it made me feel like that kid again, who wanted to be closer to her and act more grown up. I invited her to sit with my group, and she invited her friends over, and it was nice. We had grown up, and we were breaking the stereotypes of just hanging out with like-minded people. And so we settled into that norm for the rest of senior year. I remember one lunch when Erica invited me to her house to see her new crocheted things. I hadn't seen her mom in some time, so I accepted. Erica had her own car, which I didn't know, and I thought it was so cool. However, she pulled into the parking lot of a local supermarket and started to get out of the car. I stopped her for a second and asked if she was all right with this, and Erica actually laughed in my face. She said that her mom made her buy all her crochet materials alone because she had to learn not to have that anxiety, and I was pretty happy for her. We got out of the car and went inside with our cart. We talked about everything and nothing until Erica said, "Is that Mrs. Perrin?" I looked where she was pointing, and a few aisles away was our substitute teacher. I said, "Yeah, that is." However, Erica was frowning while staring straight at the teacher. I asked her what was wrong, and she responds, "I didn't know Mrs. Perrin had a daughter." I looked again, and our teacher was pulling a struggling little girl. I didn't know why I hadn't noticed before, but it didn't seem like anything major. I remember saying something like, "Oh wow, she must have had her kid young." And Erica immediately countered with, "Yeah, something's wrong here." I looked over and she had her paranoid face on, the one where she looked like she was afraid a bomb was going to fall on her head. I asked her to stop it because it was just a teacher with her daughter at the market, perfectly normal. I started to walk to the next aisle, in the opposite direction of the sub, but Erica took my hand and gave me this face, saying, "Please, just listen to me once. Let's go over there, let's say hello. I just feel like something bad's happening." And I sighed and said, "Okay, let's go say hello." We walked over there faster than was normal while we pulled a shopping cart, and I almost ran into Erica's back because she stopped so abruptly. I leaned away to see what she was looking at and noticed Mrs. Perrin, the girl that she had been polling, and a strange man. Mrs. Perrin was pushing the little girl over to the man, and after truly looking at her small, distressed face, I immediately knew that Erica was right. But I didn't have time to process before Erica was yelling at the top of her lungs like nothing I had ever heard, and in this market that noise echoed horribly. Everyone immediately turned to look at us, including the man and Mrs. Perrin. Mrs. Perrin came up to us with this horrible grimace on her face and started to push Erica to the floor, yelling, "Shut up." I had taken a step back, but Erica was still screaming and not stopping for anything, and it caught every shopper's attention. Suddenly, I noticed that the man had just suddenly run off. I had no idea where, and then a crying woman appeared on the other side of the aisle. She runs up to this little girl, who then sprints into her arms, yelling, "Mom." Jesus Christ. And that's when this truly sunk in for me what was happening. Mrs. Perrin looked around and spat in Erica's direction and ran off. People tried to grab her, but she was skinny and faster than I'd ever imagined. At that moment, my friend started to cry, and I had no idea but to kneel down with her and just hug her, letting her know that everything's okay, that that little girl was okay. I had to call Erica's mom, and I called my mom too, and both came in, and we were taken to this little room in the back and asked some questions by the police. Erica managed to calm down enough to explain what we both had witnessed, but she and I had seen two very different things. Erica saw Mrs. Perrin polling the girl, and I knew that she had been struggling, but I thought it was just a tantrum. My friend saw a little girl being pulled by a stranger, and she immediately was taken back to that day and knew. When we walked over and reached the aisle, Erica explained that Mrs. Perrin was giving that little girl to the same man who tried to snatch her all those years ago. Or, I suppose, at least what she perceived to be the same man based on her trauma. She was little, but she said she never forgot that face, and I was floored. I didn't understand how that was possible, though, when Erica told me years ago that the man had been caught, and I had a very different perception of cops, I guess. That was my introduction to the real world and how things, particularly crimes, aren't always wrapped up so neatly. We both had to give statements to the officers, and I asked one of them, "You'll catch them, right?" And I specifically remember him looking at me and just saying nothing, and it was almost like he tried to tell me, "We'll try, but don't get your hopes up." When we left that office and had to walk back through the supermarket, the crying woman came over and wrapped her arms around Erica, thanking her for saving her daughter, and I cried just watching them. And she was right. If my friend hadn't been traumatized so badly and been so paranoid for most of her life, a little girl might have actually been taken that day. I fell into a bit of a rabbit hole after that experience. realizing that kid snatching like that is not as uncommon as we believe, and that cops aren't superheroes who can just solve every single case like on TV, and it was a true awakening to me. Someone else had an epiphany too. Erica's mom realized my friend was still traumatized because this incident brought back that fear tenfold, and she finally got her a therapist, even though at the time it was still a very modern concept, very LA, I guess you could say. She did well as expected afterward, and we remained friends for the rest of our high school time, and we kept some contact in college, but reconnected fully when we both moved back to our town. We have our own families now, and I actually do see her often. She's my best friend, and while I know that I can't live with the whole paranoid thing that much, it doesn't actually hurt to be aware of your surroundings at times. I'm just going to include several experiences I had while delivering pizza for a popular pizza chain a long time ago. I live in a small rural town in the southeast United States, and it has the usual suburban developments as well as some more outlying country/rural areas. When I was younger, just as I had moved out on my own, I worked as a pizza delivery guy, and these are some of the creepy encounters I had during this time. One afternoon, I got a delivery order for an area of town that I rarely, if ever, visited. It was on the east side of town, which was very run down and poor. An old textile mill used to employ many in that area, but had been closed for some time and been overrun with kudzu and had begun falling apart. The houses around this area often had failing foundations or were very old, rusty trailer homes. This particular order was to one of the trailer homes, and I knocked, and no one answered. I tried again for several minutes, as I could hear music coming from the inside, and I figured maybe they couldn't hear me. When they finally opened the door, it was a skinny dude with no shirt on, and he asked me to step inside. When I walked in, there was a lady behind him who was wearing a robe and another sketchy couple standing at the back of the room. They had a boombox playing loud country music. These people were high and drunk, which I was used to, but this place was buzzing with crazy. All of them were at least 10 years older than me, and as I sat the pizza down and waited for payment, they started making really inappropriate comments regarding my body. Whenever one would say something, another would encourage them to continue. Eventually, the guy who opened the door walked over to me, and the lady behind him said, "Go ahead, pay the man." And he handed me the cash and put his free hand on my arm, and in a very hot breath full of natural light, he whispered in my ear and said, "Hey, we're all about to get real weird, if you want to join us." I just said no thanks, and made a beeline for the door. My other story is a time that I got 2 orders for the same area of town that I mentioned above. One was a 20 pie order for a church fellowship hall, and the other a single pie for a residence. I dropped the pies for the church off first and then headed over to the last customer. When I arrived, I immediately noticed the house looked off-putting, dark and dirty. I was like, please let this be the wrong house, but it wasn't. There was a creepy old naked doll on the porch, and an empty bird cage hung from one of the trees in the side yard. I got out, grabbed the pizza, and slowly walked up to the house. I tried the doorbell, which was glowing, so I figured it worked. No one answered, so I tried knocking. Again, nothing. Eventually, I got creeped out, so I started walking back to my car. And halfway to my car, I heard a psst. And I turned around to see an old man with wild and unkempt hair literally peeking his head out from the back of the house. It was getting dark out and my patience was draining, so I was not in the mood for someone playing games, and I simply said, "Did you order a pizza?" and waited for him to answer, but he ducked back out of sight. I started to just turn to leave, but then he peeked out again. I said, "Sir, is this your pizza or not?" And finally he reemerges. He walks up to me carrying a shovel, of all things, and he says, "Yeah, man, sorry, I'm just messing. Don't mean nothing by it." to which I responded with the total and held the pizza out. And luckily that was the end of the transaction and I was just able to get out of there. I worked the same job for a few years and had plenty more weird experiences that then moved on to find something better and safer. If you work delivering items to people at their homes, stay safe and never go inside their house. I normally am a nighttime walker because I have a cat that roams as well. I sometimes like to make sure he's okay or that the roads are clear. I don't want to get into more details about my cat being outdoors, but I do come from a toxic, abusive family dynamic and they won't allow him indoors. I'm also on disability, so yeah, I'm a loser still living at home. Anyways, I'm 36 years old and I make sure I'm aware of my surroundings and I take precautions when walking. I've had randoms stop and ask me questions sometimes, but never experienced something quite like this. So I went out for a walk at midnight. I usually take a brisk walk and I'm fine, but this time, as I was reaching the end of the street and turned back to walk home, a man in a big white van stopped and asked me a question. He opens up his window and says, "What are you doing and where are you going?" I replied that I was walking back home. He then suggested that I take a lift from him because he didn't want to see me walking home alone at night. I declined his offer and told him to leave me alone, assuring him that I could walk home safely if he just kept driving. He drove off, but then made a U-turn back towards where I was walking, seemingly to watch me and maybe see where I lived. I stopped walking, waiting for him to pass, but he didn't. Instead, he stopped his van again and said that he just wanted me to get home safely, once more requesting that I get in his van. I declined again. At this point I got very angry and told him to stop following me, explaining that I couldn't show him where I lived. He then drove off slowly but stopped at my street, which was just up ahead. I decided to make a U-turn and run into one of the side roads where I could hide. He didn't show up and I thought he was gone, so I came out of hiding and walked slowly just in case. Then I saw a car's headlights approaching around the bend, so I quickly jumped into a cluster of big plants on the sidewalk. I easily ducked down and he didn't see me. I saw his white van driving slowly past me and then turning into the road that I had just come from. He made a U-turn and went back the way he came. I waited for a while, feeling like a cat hiding and waiting for a safe moment to come out again. And finally the coast was clear and I couldn't see his van anywhere, so I made a run for home. Thank God I made it home safe and sound, and I made sure to look around me and in the shadows to see if he had parked his van anywhere else, but I didn't see it. I don't know who that man was or whether he was genuinely concerned for my safety or if he was up to something else. What do you guys think? I'm sitting here with a cup of tea, just trying to process what just happened. I'll preface this by saying we were 12 or 13 at the time, and my friend and I often snuck out either of our houses during sleepovers for late-night walks. And this was the basis of this terrifying encounter, and it stopped us from ever sneaking out after dark again. My friend lived opposite a huge forest, so her house was the preferred choice to sneak out of for us to roam around at night, because the forest was more scary and thrilling, and we always took flashlights, food, and blankets so we could camp out for a couple of hours before going back home again. Well, on this fateful night, we inadvertently fell asleep instead of staying awake, so when my friend suddenly jolted me from sleep, it was well past 3 a.m., a lot later than we usually snuck out. We grabbed our essentials and creeped out of the back door into the cold and dark night. Frost crunched underfoot as we crossed the deserted road, and as we reached the entrance to the forest, we noticed that it was pitch black and completely silent. It was almost unnervingly so. We turned on our torches and stepped into the uneven path into the forest, and the light illuminating the trees swaying in the icy wind. We stepped on fallen, sodden leaves and bark as we made an unsteady but familiar way into our favorite part of the forest, our cold breath the only noise to invade the deafening silence. We reached the small hut that we constructed one afternoon, made entirely of sticks, purely for the purpose of having some shelter for our campouts. There were times that vandals or other kids damaged our hut, but for the most part, it stayed intact, but on this occasion, it was completely destroyed, sort of like a harbinger of worse to come. We were just deciding to just call it a night and come back later on that day to repair the hut when we heard it. This loud shrieking giggle that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My friend and I jumped in shock and looked at each other like, what? And we were completely freaked out. The eerie and unnatural giggle rang out again, contradicting the silence and making my body break out into goosebumps. "Someone's in here," my friend whispered to me, looking completely terrified. "We have to go now." Her voice of rationale made it even more scary and unnerving to me that someone was in the forest with us at 3 o'clock in the morning. We just looked at each other in assent and took off running in unison, our footsteps navigating the path as naturally as we could from muscle memory, our uneven gasps of air punctuating the giggling that seemed to be following us, getting closer and closer. Our torches' light went up and down with our fast movements, illuminating random patches of the trees and bushes as we finally saw a small sliver of light as we came to the forest entrance. Running out of the forest, we didn't stop until we reached the back door of my friend's house and almost collapsed in a breathless heap of relief to be safe. Then my friend's eyes went wide and she nudged me, pointing a shaky finger to across the road. We saw this very haggard woman of indeterminate age standing at the forest entrance. She seemed to be hobbling, exiting the forest as we did, looking left and right like she was looking for something. We let out a scream, ran to my friend's bedroom, looking out the window through the smallest gap in the curtain, and could still see the woman sort of hobbling back and forth, looking around. Worse yet was that she was just hobbling back and forth, seemingly with no purpose other than potentially looking for us. She turned very slowly and walked back into the forest again. Now, the area is known for having homeless and various drug addicts wandering the forest at times, but it was very rare and very infrequent, especially in that area. We never went back to that forest nor went out after dark again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you get a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, or over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I've been a nasty girl.